you don't have to go that hard every day in training with the high intensity sessions. You're building the cake, but racing is eating the cake, as we say in Norway. You got to balance that. If you eat the cake too much, then you're going to be in trouble. It's been given these different names, polarized and 80-20 and things like that. But what the fundamental commonality, the most consistent thing you see is that most of the training of the best performers, independent of endurance sport, if their event lasts 4 or 5 minutes or longer, all the way out to hours and hours, they're training fairly similarly, and most of their training intensity is, in the physiology terms, below that first lactate turn point. In everyday language, you would say they're training at what for them is fairly easy talking pace, fairly comfortable, but they're doing it sometimes for a long time. It is very adaptive. It generates adaptations in the heart, in the musculature. You don't have to go full bore, full speed to get those adaptations. Now, they do some of that high intensity work also. There's more variability.
This is Extramilest Show, episode number 50. 50 already. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Floris Gierman, and on this podcast I speak with different guest experts about ways to become a stronger, healthier and happier athlete. And for this special episode, number 50, I'm giving away several different large prizes, and I'll be sharing more information about that at the end of this intro. Finally had a chance to sit down with Dr. Siren Seiler. He's been on my radar for many years, and I'm so glad that we're finally able to record a conversation. Many of you listening have probably heard of the 80-20 approach that also applies to endurance training, meaning that 80% of your workout intensity is at a lower intensity and about 20% of your workouts are at a higher intensity. Dr. Siren Seiler, he has studied many of the world-class elite athletes, and he started drawing several different conclusions, and he actually was able to identify this 80-20 rule that applies to endurance training as well, of how some of the best elite athletes are training. And this polarized training approach is quite counterintuitive in the early stages, but now it is being widely accepted by many different coaches and athletes out there. Dr. Seiler is a well-known exercise physiologist located in Norway, and we talk about exercise physiology, talk about training adaptations in particular regarding endurance sports. For this episode, number 50, I'm going to be giving away 2 large prizes. The first one is a $150 gift card for Path Projects. This is the only running apparel that I run in, and many women actually enjoy the Path Projects gear as well. The running shirts, the beanies and the hats. I'm also giving away a lifetime membership to my personal best running coaching program, and more info can be found at pbprogram.com. To enter to win one of these 2 prizes, just let me know in the comments on YouTube what was your favorite lesson, your favorite quote or takeaway from this episode. I know there's so many different nuggets in here. I would love to hear from you in the comments. What was it that stood out to you over there? And this actually becomes a really fun summary from a community perspective of what the different takeaways from people was. So yeah, I would love to hear from you there. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Siren Seiler. Welcome to the Extramilest Show. Really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your experiences over here.
Well, thanks for the invitation. And I was impressed with an interview you did with Eliud Kipchoge. And I thought, well, I'm in good company if you've had an interview with him. So
thank you so much. Yeah, that was really an honor to have him on the show, and that's absolutely same here. Like I followed your work for many years, and just being able to take a deep dive into some of the research that you have done. Really looking forward to our chat here. So maybe we could start out by you clarifying to some of the audience who might not be that familiar with your work. Let's talk about exercise science for a little bit. And maybe you can clarify what is really exercise science and what drew you to it? What got you excited to really dive so much of your life into this?
Yeah, well, for me, it's a great question because it obviously has been pretty important for me. But when I was young, I loved two things. I loved playing sports, and I was kind of a science geek, and I liked, looking under a microscope and going out and finding fossils, and just, I just liked being out in nature and understanding. And I had a little laboratory literally under the stairs of my house that my parents let me set up. So I lived this kind of dichotomous world where I had my sports friends and my nerd friends. And so, and then in school, I won the physics award, and then I was a fairly good, American football player. So it was always this kind of, but they just didn't fit together. And then I read this chapter in a book. It was by Jim Fixx. It was the complete book of running, and there was a chapter on the science. It was called The Scientists of Sport, and this book was from, like, I don't know, 1981 or somewhere in there. But I just read that chapter. I even just, by the time I looked at the title, I thought, oh my goodness, this is me. This puts it together.
What it all, yeah.
And so I just thought, oh man, I got to do this. And this was early days in exercise science, and so then you say, well, what is exercise science? And it is a kind of a integrated view of the various aspects of the human body and movement, which includes biomechanics, it includes psychology, it includes physiology. So it is a integrated discipline that draws from various, you might say, the pure disciplines, the biochemistry, the physics, and so forth, and then takes the pieces that are needed to explain human movement, to explain and understand the training, the adaptation process. So, that's kind of exercise science, and the early programs in the United States, and I got into one of the early ones fairly early, and they started emerging in the late 70s, I'd say, and early 80s, and then have slowly evolved. And there's different aspects. Exercise science goes in the direction of health, goes in the direction of performance, so there's different emphasis areas within it. And I have done a bit of both, but my emphasis now in these last 20 years has been more connected to, you might say, sports science, more that the focus on the development, the performance development process, and, a little bit looking more at what happens once you've already trained quite a bit. Going from untrained to train, almost anything works. But once you have trained a while, then things become a little bit more tricky in terms of getting it right. And then I found that interesting.
It is so fascinating how new this field still is, and you just explaining some of those timelines indeed, and how much things how much knowledge is still coming to the table, like over the last even decade, if you see how much breakthroughs are happening over here. So what sort of changes have you been seeing? Like since the early days, there were certain mentalities, and then later on things have changed quite a bit as well. And like one of your big breakthroughs in this area as well has been about the training hierarchy, and with the volume, the intensity, and the overall distribution, that you have really focused quite a bit of your research on that. Can you maybe explain a little bit further, like high level, like this whole concept?
Well, where do I begin? I need to step back a little bit and say, that there are aspects of people. There have been wonderful physiologists, wonderful people that have studied the human body and movement going back to 100 years plus. So we need to, I don't want to say that sports science started in 1980. That would be unfair and incorrect. But its formalization as an academic discipline, that it took a while to get there. So just so we're clear on that, there were wonderful people like A.V. Hill and that were doing work in the 20s, the early teens, and the Harvard Fatigue Laboratory before the Second World War. So the predecessors of the exercise science movement were 30, 40, 50 years before that. So just so we're clear on that. And then if you think about the growth of exercise science, where was it happening? Well, it was happening in universities. It was happening at these various programs. And who were the subjects then? Who were these professors studying? Well, they were studying the students. They could pull in students as volunteers of volunteers. No, I mean, I'm kidding, but and who were they? Well, they were physically active, but generally not specifically trained, and so they were pretty untrained relative to what we would say is trained for a good endurance athlete. And then they started doing those early studies of the training process, of the adaptation process. And I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, you can go back to Halazzi, who did the early studies on rats and mice and made them run and found that there were more mitochondria. That was an adaptation. Now we think of that as like, well, we've known that forever, but that wasn't that long ago. It was 50 years ago, 45, 50 years ago. 1967, let's say, so a little over 50. So that in the scope of human knowledge, that's still pretty early days, where we understood that these adaptations were happening, that the body was literally producing more mitochondria, more capillaries, and all this. So, and the early studies were mostly on these untrained people. And if you had them train 4 or 5 days a week at 75% of their maximum heart rate, 75, 80, kind of like their threshold, 45 minutes a day, they got better. Their VO2 max goes up. You get some adaptations. It works, and you do it in 8 weeks, 10 weeks. So those were the typical studies that were done, and that makes sense too, because let's face it, these were students. So you got the semester schedule. So there are constraints in the research you're doing that are a function of just the realities, just the practical issues of, well, these students, if we do it in the spring semester, that's January. If we can get started by the 1st of February, we can be finished by the, early May, and, we can get it done, and we can, in the master student, it's always, we have to think like that practical way.
Yeah.
Oh, but that results in a body of knowledge that's based on fairly short time frames and mostly untrained people.
That is the big difference, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So then, and then you extrapolate, and then you assume, well, here's threshold training is great. And, and so you make some extrapolations from those early studies. And then in, I would say early 90s and moving forward, we start to get a little bit of data from a few sources, from rowing, that says, wait a minute, they're doing, it doesn't quite look like that among the best. They're not training for 45 minutes a day, and they're not training at threshold. They're training more time, but they're distributing the intensity differently. So we start to see, but it's kind of just small pieces. It's anecdotal. And then, late 90s, 2000s, some more data starts rolling in. And that's when I had moved to Norway in 95, 6, and just started seeing things that didn't match up with my academic training.
Let's talk about that part, because I find that very fascinating, of kind of like the one way of research and approaching thing, and there was a lot of no pain, no gain mentality. And then there was also a different type of approach that started getting more interest from your end, and from there on, like from other athletes and researchers as well. So let's talk through that a bit more.
My thesis has always been that developments in the sports, in training, have not emerged from scientists, with very few exceptions. They have emerged from the laboratory of the forest and the roads and the water, where people are training and coaches are watching, and trial and error is happening, dating back to Zatopek and to Lydiard, and to, you can go back into Waldemar Gerschler and Harbig, Rudolf Harbig, who had the world record in the 800 meters, in 1939. And it was experimental. It was trial and error. It was understanding their perception of what the physiology was. And so, but it was not coming from laboratories. It was coming from the field, or it was coming from a laboratory, but you could more of the laboratory of sports training. And then the scientists were coming along and trying to explain it, trying to understand it. And so we need to keep that clear and make sure. And I don't anybody should think that I figured this out, that I made up polarized training or I made up this distribution. No, I just saw it. I just measured it and just said, wait a minute, this is very different from the conventional wisdom that has emerged from all of those studies, those good studies on students. You know what I'm saying? It was just a different group.
Yeah.
Fast forward a bit, we would kind of say, look, what we see now is that, let's take Formula One racing, which is maybe the most technologically driven sport there is, with 300 sensors on every car, and unique technological development. Well, Formula One racing and the technological innovation, it scales down to your Toyota or your Volvo or your Mercedes in your garage 5 years later. There is a scalability. We learn from that high performance environment, and innovation emerges that is useful, but the opposite doesn't occur. The family Ford, the family Volvo does not tell you how to build a Formula One car. Nothing about it helps. It's just not the same planet. So you have to think from scratch. If you're going to build a Formula One car, you're kind of going to say, well, if we just power up the Volvo or power up the family station wagon, it'll function as a Formula One. No, it doesn't work that way. Well, it's kind of like that with training, is that, if you haven't done anything, you can do just about anything and you'll get better as an untrained person for at least a few months. Then you're going to stagnate. But if you've only ever measured that initial phase, then that's all you see, right? You're missing the reality that it stagnates, that you get a plateau effect, that those same workouts they're no longer optimal for further enhancements. But you see different information emerges when you measure these high performance athletes. And that's kind of what the last 20 years, that's where we've been, a lot of different good groups have been really getting into those weeds and trying to understand in different ways. And then I often start lectures with this thing is, how do I study endurance? And it starts for me nowadays with just understanding what the best athletes actually do, respecting the knowledge that they possess, that the coach athlete enterprise, there is institutional knowledge there, and there is this developmental process. There's self-organizational principles. These different groups, the runners, the cyclists, the rowers from different countries and cultures, if they are organizing themselves in similar ways, and we're emerging, there are similar patterns of training that are emerging from these quite disparate groups, then that, for me, I start saying, well, that suggests some universal truths. And those were, for me, very interesting. I wasn't so much interested in exactly how rowers train or how cyclists train, but more what do they have in common, right? Because those commonalities probably give us a foundation for understanding human physiology.
What was one of those main conclusions indeed about the running intensity? And let's talk about that topic for a bit, because you scaled it down to 3 zones and 5 zones when you were talking about the intensity distribution there. That was the fascinating part, when listening to your TED Talk and seeing all of the different examples that you're using indeed, and what you mentioned here as well. It is not just the endurance runners. It is the cyclists, it is the cross-country skiers, all at a high level that have a very even distribution across these different sports between these different zones. Can you explain a little bit further what that breakdown is?
It's been given these different names, polarized and 80-20 and things like that. But what the fundamental commonality, the most consistent thing you see is that most of the training of the best performers, independent of endurance sport, if their event lasts 4 or 5 minutes or longer, all the way out to hours and hours, they're training fairly similarly. And most of their training intensity is, in the physiology terms, below that first lactate turn point. In everyday language, you would say they're training at what for them is fairly easy talking pace, fairly comfortable, but they're doing it sometimes for a long time. So I often think I need to be careful calling it easy, because it's purposeful. Most of us couldn't do what they do for those hours each day, but it is not at that super huff and puff high intensity. They're not there every day. They're not there every workout. They can't be. But it turns out that volume, that frequency of training, that regular exposure to 65% of VO2 max, 2 hours, 4 hours on the bike, those 2-hour runs, it is very adaptive. It generates adaptations in the heart, in the musculature. You don't have to go full bore, full speed to get those adaptations. Now, they do some of that high intensity work also. Absolutely. That's consistently there. But how they manipulate that, and whether it's threshold or whether it's closer to VO2 max, and there's more variability in those recipes that can be specific to the duration of their sport, some details. But the big picture is that humans can't train hard every day. You can't. It breaks down. The human will break down. The horse will break down. The animal will break down too. We've got data from racehorses too. They can train really hard on their hard days, but they have to also go easy on their easy days, just like humans, or they break down. So there's some fundamental physiology there, and then you have to take training. The training process is a yin and yang process, in the sense that, yes, I am trying to use exercise to induce signals that drive protein synthesis. I mean, it's my, I'm trying to make more mitochondria. I'm trying to build more capillaries. I'm trying to, at the fundamental level, we're all being molecular biologists. We're trying to create some phenotypic expression of our genes. We're trying to push our genetic potential in a different direction towards more endurance or more strength or whatever, depending on how we're training. And so that's the one side, but the other side of the puzzle is, or the coin is, hey, this training is stressful. It causes stress. It challenges the body. It disturbs homeostasis. It does damage muscles. There's damage to muscles. There's immune system challenges. There's inflammation. So then you start to say, okay, that suggests that training becomes, over time, you've got to balance these. Just like the yin and the yang, you've got to find the right, becomes an optimization problem. It's not a maximization problem. And those are very different, if you know what I mean. Maximize just means well, if I were to just train harder, I'd get better. Harder, better, harder, better, harder, better, better. It doesn't work that way, right? You have to, maximization doesn't work. It's optimization. And then you're starting to say, okay, how do I find a rhythm of signal recovery, adaptation? And that's what we're seeing. And the data is coming in. Now we're getting more mechanistic explanations for a lot of this, both on the signaling side and on the stress side, that say, okay, wow, that actually makes sense why this pattern is emerging, this kind of, 80-20 or easy hard, or, I want to be careful with my terminology, but I think there is a lot of progress being made explaining why the athletes have evolved in that direction.
It's very eye-opening indeed to look at it from that perspective. I think when we see, sometimes we analyze elite athletes and they have a lot of time available to train. They have more time to rest and to sleep occasionally. When we then look at the recreational runner who has a full-time job, family life, a lot of other responsibilities outside of athletic performance, sometimes there are some of these additional layers that get involved as well. So I'm curious, in your research of what you have shown, this 80-20 approach, does that work as well for the elite athlete as for the recreational runner?
Well, the answer I'm going to give you is, in some ways it works even better.
Yeah.
And that's weird, I know. But the reality, because here's what I mean. If you are a high performance athlete and you're pushing the very limits of what you can handle, it almost forces you into a certain pattern. You can't train 25 hours a week and at the same time go hard every day. So the body will it'll force you to a certain degree into a pattern. But if you're training 4 days a week or 5 days a week and say 8 hours a week, well, yeah, you can, you can fall into that kind of temptation to go medium hard every day.
And we see that so often happening, right? Like a lot of spending time in that yellow zone in between no man's land, not slow enough, not hard enough.
And I get it. I mean, it's easy to fall into it. I cycle on this virtual platform, this Zoom. Zwift. I'm sorry, Zwift, not Zoom. We're on Zoom now. But I zoom around on Zwift, and it's easy to start what we call chasing the squirrels. There's just that guy he cycled past me. I think I'll catch up with him, and then maybe he just thinks he's faster than me. Well, I'll show him. And so you just fall into this. Our egos get us in trouble, and whereas what I always say is one of the things we see with great endurance athletes like Kipchoge is they have intensity discipline, and their ego is robust enough to not be too concerned with some silly teenage runner that runs past them on a day, because Kipchoge knows what he's good for, right? Yeah. And he's not gonna chase that squirrel. But if that guy comes back on a day when Kipchoge is doing one of his tough runs, well, it's a different ballgame. You know what I mean? Come back another day. So, yeah. And but recreational athletes, age groupers, the most common training mistake they will make is that regression towards the mean, this medium hard intensity, fairly short workouts, fairly high intensity, repetitive and monotone, a monotone load, and they stagnate, right? And I can't, with my hand over my heart, I cannot tell you, I can't even count how many emails and text messages and Twitter messages I have received from people who have said, my goodness, what a difference this makes. Yes. I have finally learned how to ease up on my easy days and figured out what easy actually means. And I've even had people say, you know what? My maximum heart rate is 10 beats higher now. I have been chronically overtrained. My only explanation is I've been chronically overtrained for 10 years because my heart rate has gone up 10 beats since I changed the way I train. So it's anecdote, but good grief, I've had so much of it from regular folks who have experienced new performance records in their 50s. A guy, he sends me a message. He says, I set a new PB in the marathon at 57. It just shows you how badly I was training in my 30s, So.
But that must be quite rewarding too, because I see, like, even on our channel, we talk quite a bit about the importance of low intensity running and really taking the time to develop that aerobic base. And like you're mentioning too, these examples of athletes who are now coming back after a run and feel like they could do it again, or they feel like they're not dying on the couch on a Saturday afternoon, feeling like they're so tired and fatigued. Like it's an entire different approach again, and very eye-opening for quite some people too who have never experienced that.
Absolutely, and I think back the way I trained when I started cycling. I went, oh my goodness! I've thought, you know what? I bet I don't think I ever even considered easy days. I don't think that was even a term.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. And so there's the easy part that we talk about, but then there's the hard part too, because when I think about, let's say 10 years ago, I got really into running, but when I think back about those earlier days, there was often that if I would do interval sessions, they would be so brutal hard that I would absolutely hate it. I would be huffing and puffing to the point that I would go to the absolute red line, and it would just be quite miserable. Whereas you're often talking as well about not going too hard on the hard days, like obviously being able to push yourself, but not pushing to an extent that it's going to set yourself back. Can you talk through that a bit?
Yeah. And in that regard, the term polarized training is probably an inappropriate term, because if it makes people think that easy is easy and hard is like even harder, then that's that misrepresents the reality. Because I think what we've learned, and I want to be careful using this term, but the sustainability training is about finding a sustainable kind of pattern of loading. And my daughter exemplifies this, is when I would tell her, okay, you're going to do 3 times 8 minutes or 4 times 8 minutes on the treadmill, and that, based on my research, we've shown that usually if you give this prescription, that the prescription is like an equation that the athlete solves, and the 4 times 8 minute prescription with 2-minute recovery puts them at about zone 4 in that 5-zone model. 90, 80, it starts about 87% of VO2 max, and then it starts drifting up, and they're ending up at 92 or so. So they're working hard, but they're not going so deep into the well. They're not at 12 millimolar lactate, they're like at 8 or 9, and it's manageable. Well, and that works on average, so the prescription generally works. But my daughter was just so darn, I don't know, competitive with herself, that every interval session, and she was dealing with her own demons and so forth, an eating disorder and stuff, where we've been open about that. And so every darn interval session was for her, it was a test of her toughness, and it wasn't sustainable. And so eventually I had to say, well, I'm sorry, but at 4 times 8, when I tell you you're going too hard, you're just blowing yourself up, and you're not recovering fast enough. And so you're kind of stagnating, because these hard sessions are just a bit too hard. So I'm putting the brakes on you. And now I'm going to actually not only just say 4 times 8 at best, it's at your best pace. I'm not going to say best pace. I'm going to say at 90%.
And so you specifically give her a heart rate, like this is your highest number.
Yeah,
like try not to go over that. Or
pulled it back, and then everything got better. And then she set a PR. She PR'd her half marathon, and so then she fell into rhythm. And I remember her using the term. She said, "Papa, now I'm in this. I feel the flow of my training."
Yeah.
And Kipchoge, your interview, he says this. He says, "I want to still be smiling when I finish the workout, so that I can wake up and train the next day." I can't remember the exact quote, but I wrote it down as best I could. And I thought, oh yeah, what a fantastic, exemplification of that property. He understands that it's not the epic workout. It is the body of work that he is doing in preparation. And so he has this beautiful innate understanding, and he uses the terminology, I want to still be smiling when I finish the interval session.
That was such a good indicator. Yeah.
Yeah. What a great analogy. I was like, oh man, you're my hero. You've taught me so much, and so, and it jives, it matches up with what we've seen from the best, in different sports. Now, don't get me wrong. There's times when you're, and people in racing, like for example, in cross country skiing, man, when they're charging that hill, they are pushing the upper limits of what they can. That's when they're hitting very close to VO2 max at the top of those hills, and they're recovering on the fly. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that these people are not going hard in races, but it turns out you don't have to go that hard every day in training with the high intensity sessions. you're building the cake, but racing is eating the cake, as we say in Norway, if that makes sense. You got to balance that. If you eat the cake too much, then you're going to be in trouble. So that's part of this. And I use a lot of kind of slang or folk language, but there's underlying physiology there. There's underlying understanding of the autonomic nervous system, the immune system, and so forth, inflammatory processes. We're getting our head around some of this, that it is explaining some of these behaviors. So the science is catching up with the trial and error experience of the high performance environments.
Yeah. Awesome. On your YouTube channel, and to anyone listening, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Seiler's YouTube channel, because there are many great detailed videos on there. You also have a few videos where you and your daughter, Siren, talk through some of her training. And I would love to talk about that a little bit further, as far as for when you're coaching her and when you're training with her. Obviously, you do work on certain training schedules or certain guidelines of workouts. How closely do you suggest her to follow these schedules, and how much does she really adjust it on a day-to-day based on how she feels or how things are progressing?
Well, my daughter, again, with the full disclosure, it's been a special case in the sense that she was a dancer for 10 years. She, at the end of her dance career, developed an eating disorder, which I never even contemplated could happen. But she was studying away from home. She was at a top sports high school, and it happened. And then part of the pathway back to health for her went through, for her, running became a carrot. She wanted to, because she just liked training. And so I said, all right, I'll be your coach. And she's the only athlete I coached, because, it was like part coach, part dad every day. The dad who's trying to help his daughter recover, keep her alive, and move her towards health. And the coach who's trying to carefully help her achieve the goals that she has, because she's very competitive. And so I was balancing these things daily, and with great, what should I say, stress, and concern for my daughter. And it took her a long time to fully recover, and she has fully recovered, and I'm so happy. But it's years, 5 years, 5.5, 6 years. So I have to, the reason I say that is because obviously that colors, that had something to do with the way I worked with her, and my conservative nature with her, and that, and also that she's my daughter. She's stubborn, and like many athletes, she's even said many times, she said, Papa or Dad, for me to find my limits, I got to go over them, and then I come back, and so she's made pretty much every mistake you can make as an endurance athlete. But at least we've been intellectually and tuned in to say, yeah, okay, now we see what happens when those interval sessions get too hard. Now we see what happens, so it's been learning for her, learning by doing, and then combining. I've had some numbers, so I've looked at her heart rate and things, and she has an innate sense of feel, and so she's kind of like a Kenyan. She just feels, and she said, Papa, I wish I could just move to Africa. I like, she loves that kind of atmosphere. She said, I would love to train with the Kenyans, So it's kind of been, we've tried to be complimentary. I said, well, I like a few numbers, and so we kind of
let's find a balance.
Yeah. And so she doodles on her daily training diary, and I look at some of the polar data, the heart rate data and whatever, and we come together around where are we right now? Where is her body, and what needs to happen, and so forth. So if she did not tell me the truth about her, how she felt, then things went shitty. Just pardon my French, but if her eating disorder was her, that voice in her head was preventing her from being honest about things, then that was just a recipe for further disaster. But when when she's able to say, Papa, you know what, I'm having these voices that things are not working, I need help, then things went well. We figured it out together. Right. So I'm just trying to say my daughter is not like exemplary of all of perfection in athletics, but she's learned a lot. I've learned a lot from that process. And I think all good coach athlete relationships, that there has to be trust, there has to be good communication, and at whatever level, that's what it starts with. And if you got that, then a lot of things will fall into place. And female athletes, male athletes, are they the same? Yeah and no. There are some differences in generalities that can be worth understanding. The big picture physiology is the same, but a bit of the personality psychology issues, the tendencies maybe are a bit different. Is my long-term experience working with different groups, and so and not just my daughter, but a lot of different groups. So coaching is amazingly wonderful and very challenging, very hard.
Absolutely.
I don't know which is harder, being a dad or being a coach, but they're both.
Especially when you combine them too. Like yesterday, I went to the running track with my 8-year-old, and we're still going through the concept of slowing down on some of your runs. And like when my 8-year-old is starting to get it, my 5-year-old only thinks like she can sprint for 10 seconds, and that's basically what she can maintain. It's
well, and that's very normal. Young children, they don't have much of an aerobic system, so it's just
I love it. Yeah,
sprint and recover. So there's no point in, you're not going to overcome that. They just have to have fun. But that's the way their body works, and then slowly it changes over time.
Yeah, and that I think too, like the whole part of like going out and playing instead of like trying to make it a workout, and just go out and play. And then you see they get really excited about it. And as soon as you mention the word running, it's like, I don't want to go running, but I do want to go playing. So yeah.
Let's go playing, which involves a lot of running, but you trick them. So I don't believe in, I just don't see the point of a lot of organized sport for 5 and 6 year olds. I see a lot of value in just super fun play.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how the human brain and the human body were designed by nature to, animals play, and they play themselves into shape. Even the tiger, the lion, the young cubs, what are they doing? They play wrestle. The baby bears wrestle with each other, and it's play, but they are literally training for the time when it will be life and death.
Yeah.
And they just don't know it. But the play is preparing them. And I think that's the way it should be with sports too, is the early exposure to movement is about, it's on the kids' terms and it's play, and if you do that well with your kids, then they will want to do more. They'll want to play more. And then eventually they'll say, I'd kind of like this play to be a bit more systematic, and so then we could start calling it training,
Yeah. Yeah. I thought you made such a good point earlier when you talked about the importance of getting your health right for maximizing and optimizing performance. And this is something you guys talked through in the analysis of Molly Seidel's video as well. You have a really, really good video on your YouTube channel where you break down Molly Seidel Olympic performance, where she earned bronze in Tokyo. And that was an exceptional performance, obviously. So it was a really nice detailed breakdown. But one of the things that came out of that video too was she experienced her fair share of injuries in the past. She has had her challenges where she worked very closely with her coach to first get back into health, get that under control before starting to build volume, before starting to add in that part. Maybe you can add a little bit more insights from what you're seeing from the perspective of Like, yeah, we can't keep pushing. We have to keep the health element under control as well. And it's that fine line in between.
Yeah, in that particular, that was my daughter. I got to give her credit. She's the one that did that analysis. She's the one that, and then she's the one that connected to Molly Seidel, because they had these commonalities in terms of Seidel had dealt with eating disorders. She had multiple stress fractures. She had some tough side effects of the eating disorder that she had to get under control. So she was a wonderful role model for my daughter, and my daughter is very good at going into the weeds and analyzing. So I just said, look, we got to do something with this, and let me help you. So let's make a video. So that's but that was her, not me. And it just, Molly Seidel resonated for her and helped her. It helped her to be inspired and see that, yeah, this can go the right way. And so I think it's good to, it's one of the wonderful things about these different outlets, social media, is that it can be helpful to find athletes that have been through some of these struggles and come out on the other side. And so that's what that was about. And I think it really, helped. And I think it helped my daughter realize, and I tried to tell her, I said, look, you have something to share. You don't have to be a world-class athlete to have a voice that can help people. And so, because she said, well, I'm not that good a runner. Nobody's going to listen to me. And I said, well, don't be so sure. So that's, and I would say that to others is, it's, if you're able to help people, if you've been through things, then you can help them. You don't have to be world champion. I'm not a world champion, and you're not either, but we can share, we can help people find the balance in their training. And getting back to your issue, in Norwegian, there's this word called overshoot. And it's a term that means energy. You have to have this overshoot. You have to have energy to do the tough things, to do sports, to push your body. And if you don't have health as a platform, then you don't have that overshoot, that extra energy to put into the process of developing your body in a different way, in a demanding way. And the body is quite remarkable in the sense that if there are problems, if this body senses energy imbalance, inflammation, if it senses there is an invader, that there's an infection, then it will dedicate resources to those deeper needs of survival, and it will turn off adaptation. It will not absorb training. It will make choices that go in a direction of a kind of a physiological Maslow's hierarchy, if you understand. And it will say, I'm not gonna build hemoglobin at altitude because you're sick. You have an infection.
That's a priority here.
The body will prioritize energy resources towards that deeper need. And then the training is wasted, right? Because your body is making decisions. When my daughter was in an imbalance, an energetic imbalance, her body's not receptive to the training adaptations at the same level. It's just not going to happen. And so this is health, no performance. And that sounds like this little philosophical mantra, but it's actually deeply embedded in biology, in the human biology. And the animal world is brutal in that regard. The worst example and the best example I can give you, when I was a master's student, my research involved rats. I was going to do this study where I was going to have one group of rats do interval training, another group of rats was going to run steady state, and a third group of rats were going to be the couch potatoes that stayed in their cages, But to get the rats, I had to breed male and female adults, and I had to make sure the wine was the right temperature, and and the room was the right and achieve some litters of rats. And this was in, I don't know, November, December, and it was anyway. So I come in to the lab, or to the facility, one morning, early 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'm cleaning, doing my usual thing. And the mothers have had pups, and they are eating their pups.
Yes, I've heard of that.
They are eating the babies. And I was like, what the heck kind of crazy freak show have I got myself into? The tails of their babies are sticking out their mouth.
That's rough.
And so then I talked to people, and they say, apparently that maybe the temperature in the room was a bit too cold or something. The mother rat her instincts have said, situation is not good. Get rid of this litter.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, this is brutal. This is brutal nature. You you couldn't even put this on a nature show. It's so brutal, And so I had to start from scratch and redo it and finally got the litters. But it was such a good example of this fundamental issue, which is that our bodies are we don't eat our young, but we still have this biology that says health first, that my body has to be in a state that is receptive for the stress of training, or the adaptations don't happen because of the allocation of resources. So it's not just good philosophy, it's physiology. And in practice, for example, in Norway, the athletes do a lot of altitude training, because in part some of the events are at moderate altitude, but also just altitude training is part of the recipe,
Mm-hmm.
But they just have found that if they have so much as a toothache before they go up, they just won't go up to camp. They just say nope, no point.
Yeah, so it's once again about the hierarchy. You have the basic under control first before.
If you've got an infection in your body, we're not sending you up to altitude because it won't happen for you. The best case scenario is nothing, and worst case scenario, you get worse. So those are just like basic rules that are in the system for the Norwegian athletes. Is have you had an infection? Do you have the sniffles? Anything? If you do, then we're probably not going to send you up to camp. This is that philosophy in practice, or that issue in practice. Health first, and then you're going to be receptive to training.
And I see it even in our own running groups and coaching, like working with a few different runners. The topic of stress has come up quite a bit, especially in the last 2 years, where people were saying like their stress levels were to an extent that they wouldn't even feel like doing higher intensity training. And we often talked about like, let's push out some of these races and let's just go to a maintenance mode and just going out there for overall health and for relaxation and feeling good, versus putting pedal to the metal, especially when those stress levels are at very high levels. So
absolutely. And I was having that same conversation with my daughter, because she's a student at a university, and all this is the tough exam period. And there's even research that shows that scholarship athletes in the United States, they did a study where they could just show that when they were in the exam period, they were less responsive to training. They didn't get the same adaptation. So stress, this generalizable state that we call stress, that the body, the human evolution doesn't differentiate the source of these threats, because you can think of it as there is a threat on our homeostasis, whether it's a threat of an exam or a threat of a boyfriend leaving me or the threat of an interval session. The basic autonomic nervous system response is the same. So the stress bucket gets filled, but the source of, the different bottles, the different sources can be different, but it's the same bucket. And, in pretty much. And so, this is something that we have to be clear about. And this is where you were going back to the fact that age groupers, regular people, they got real jobs, they've got kids at home, they've got all of these realities. Yeah, in many ways, their training situation is more difficult than the high performance triathlete that's sponsored by such and such, and they're able to train every day and sleep at noon, take a nap. And you know what I'm saying? That's a different reality. They've earned the right to do that with their talent and their efforts. But once they get there, they actually have in some ways, an easier situation or a more conducive situation to performance than the 35-year-old mom with 2 kids that also is training for a triathlon.
Yeah, and I see it around me too. Some of my friends who are indeed like parents of 2 kids who have a full-time job, we're still trying to go out there 20, 25, sometimes 30 hours a week. And it's at that point, it becomes a fine line with how much can you sleep and how much can you train too, because I also see athletes making that mistake where sleep gets compromised, whereas a lot of training benefits come from that part again. So yeah, it's all about that fine line there. So.
And everybody has their own motivation. And so I have great respect for that. But I do think sometimes we have to step back and say, what's my motivation here?
Yeah.
Am I operating from a position of health and happiness? Am I able to smile at the end of these workouts? As my hero Kipchoge would say, or am I finding myself, I'm putting myself on this running wheel, and I'm I don't know, feeling some pressure to perform for the rest of the world or for my office mates or whatever. What is my motivation here? And so I do think our modern society and social media and that we get pulled into things that aren't very healthy, and so I guess every once in a while I just want to say, hey, are you having fun?
I'm so glad you bring that up, because that has really become a common theme throughout different guests that I've had on the podcast. Indeed, the very important part of having fun and joy in your workouts for the longevity in the sport. It's not what are you going to be able to do in 2 months, but where are you going to be in 2 years, in 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I lately in the last year or so, I've been asking often in lectures, I ask the question, how many workouts will you do this year? Or will your athlete do this year? Put a number on it. And people start thinking, I said, what's it going to be? 300, 400, maybe even 500 workouts that you're going to do this year if you're a top high performance athlete. But if you're an age grouper, 300 is not an unreasonable number. 300 workouts you will do in this year. That's training 5 times a week, 5, 6. Now think about it. What would be a really, really good improvement for you this year in your, triathlon, Olympic distance time or whatever? Would a 5% improvement be good? Oh my goodness, it would be fantastic, right? Think if you improve 5% in your half marathon time. That is huge. That, in fact, it's pretty much unrealistic, right? 3%, 2%, 1%, but let's say 5% just for fun. All right, now I want you to do the math and divide 5% by 300. Divide 0.05 by 300. What do you get? Well, I can't tell you exactly, but you get a tiny, tiny number. And it's not a number that you can identify. You're not going to be able to see it. So it should tell us something about that these epic workouts, the individual workout is not what leads to performance gains. It's the sum of it all. It's the process. It's the sustainability of the process, right? It is being healthy and staying healthy and being able to do the 300 workouts, being able to do the 400 or 500 if you're, Blumenfeld, or Gustav Eden, the guy who won, he debuts with a record in the Ironman. It's sustainable. It's the daily grind. It's the finding that balance and having the health to do all of that work that builds up to being able to perform on race day. So it's just a bit of a mindset issue. Is let's back up, let's zoom out, and don't get so zoomed in on this particular workout. We have a tendency to say,
should I do like, 6 times 4, or should I do 4 times 6? Should the rest interval be 90 seconds, or should it be 120 seconds? And I tell people, I said, look, guys, it ain't that complicated. And your muscle cells are not that sophisticated in terms of their precise evaluation of the execution. It's pretty simple. Do the work, and get some high intensity work in, and collect some minutes at high, and it can be 30 minutes, it'd be 88% or 92%, approximations end up being close enough often. And so I just find that a lot of people are getting too wrapped up in details that turn out to not be as important as bigger picture issues. And they forget the bigger picture because they get zoomed in so narrowly into the specific structure of the epic workout that they're going to do.
Yeah,
that's me on my preacher's stool right now.
No, I love it. I couldn't agree more with you right there. So that's very well said. I have a few last questions here. I do want to be respectful of your time. So way back in the day when heart rate monitors first came out, it was like these big bulky machines, and it was more for like a doctor office, or it was only for like the researchers. Now it has come a long way. A lot of people have their own chest heart rate monitor strap, or they have it on the optical, or they have it like, there's a lot more tools available right now. We're starting to see.
Mine is this. It's even this big.
Is that the armband?
Yeah, I love it. I've been using it for 3
which one is
years.
that one?
This is the Polar OH1.
Yeah,
so free advertising. I love it. I'm not. Nobody pays me anything, but anyway, my daughter and I both use this.
Nice.
I use it on my forearm, and she uses it on her bicep.
Good. We're now also seeing, like, from the Aura ring with the sleep tracking, we see the permanent blood glucose meter and all of these kind of things. It has come a long way. Are there any additional, like, obviously it used to be very research driven. Now there's a lot more data, like bigger data available out there. I know in your Twitter, sometimes you do run some of those group initiatives where it almost like you're collecting back some of this data, which has been really fascinating to follow, actually. Are there some things in some of the new bio tracking that excite you, like what's happening now, or what's going to be coming here in the next 3 to 5 years?
The issue that I've been fascinated with in the last year is breathing. Strangely enough, it is as a group from the UK, they wrote an article about it. It was the kind of the forgotten vital sign or whatever, and if you're unconscious, you've been injured, and you are wheeled into a hospital, the first 2 things that the doctors or nurses will evaluate is your heart beating? Are you breathing? And then more specifically, what's your heart rate? What's your breathing rate? Right. And that has extremely, a lot of value for them in making some initial decisions about the state of your body. These are called vital signs. Now, in sports, we have discovered decades ago the heart rate as a window into the human physiology, into what intensity am I working at relative to my max. And it's a powerful tool, and we've done a great job in making that accessible to people, and pretty good job at calibrating it and so forth. But there are situations, there are movement situations, training situations where heart rate doesn't tell you everything you'd like to know. For example, during interval training, during these, different kinds of stochastic work with lots of variations in tempo, and that heart rate kind of may find a middle zone that's reflective of the overall oxygen demand, but your brain is saying, yeah, but this is harder than that, right? Because those peaks are costing me a lot. Well, if we measure your breathing, even something as simple as your breathing rate, just what breathing frequency are you at? It tracks with the realities that you're facing in terms of getting that work done, of mobilizing, maintaining that pace in those repeats or in those intervals, even better than heart rate.
And that's one of the things that's fascinated me, because I was looking at the heart rate. I've developed some tools. I've spoken a lot about cardiac drift, about internal workload versus external workload, how these there's no such thing as a steady state during training, and that we can measure this kind of internal workload shift relative to the external. Does that make sense? Yeah. And it works, and it's important, and it's useful, and it tells us that the first hour run of a 2-hour run is not the same as the second hour. The second hour is harder, even though the pace is the same. You can't equate those because they are your efficiency. Things are breaking down in your body. It's costing more to do that same work, whether it's cycling or rowing or swimming or running. And so we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to understand that intensity has no meaning without putting a duration to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a unidimensional construct that only has meaning when we add duration. Right? I can hold any pace up to 1,300 watts for a second. But already
and crash and burn.
But already after 10 seconds, I've lost a lot of, and after 2 minutes, it's a different. So these power values and pace values only have meaning when I attach a duration to them, right? We're not in a steady state. Heart rate reflects some of that, but in that very high intensity regime and the stochastic regime where you're doing lots of this, up and down cross country, and so ventilation tells us some things. And that if you've raced, you can hear your competition. How are they breathing? And there's famous examples of athletes that have kind of come up to the side of an athlete, and can tell they're breathing hard, and then they attack, or they hide. They try to hide the fact that they're like, so they're trying to hold their breath as they run up, so we know it instinctively that breathing is a truth teller, right? So long story short, we're really getting into the weeds and trying to understand breathing and what it can tell us, and whether we can use it we can scale breathing in the same way we can do with heart rate reserve, where you take maximum heart rate versus resting heart rate, and you have the percentage of the heart rate reserve. You can do that. You can do that with breathing too. You can do that with breathing frequency.
Yeah, when does it change over, right?
Yeah, and you can find your athletes kind of maximum breathing frequency when they're really in the cellar, all the way maximum effort. You know what the resting breathing frequency is. It's pretty typical, 12 to 16, somewhere in there. And so you can establish this range, and then you can use that as an intensity scale. And it turns out it has more scope than the heart rate part of the scale, So anyway, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but that is a variable that is very basic, and new technology is making it possible for that to be kind of measured just as easily or easier than heart rate in the daily grind. And so we'll see whether that can help us do a better job of monitoring and perceiving where we are and when to say, that's enough. I've done enough work today. I'm at 85% of my breathing frequency. If I go farther than that, then I'm really I'm going to blow up. Then it's too much. And I think we're going to get there. And so that's an area that I'm spending a lot of time on right now.
I love hearing that. Like, I've previously had the Iceman Wim Hof on the podcast when we talked about breathing quite a bit, and about how you can also, like, if you're very highly stressed, how to reset your autonomous nervous system through breathing. And then I had Patrick McCowan on the podcast as well. We talked about nasal breathing quite a bit, which is another topic that I thought was quite fascinating.
Yeah, I've done that. I've tried that.
I saw you on Twitter. Like, please describe a little bit more about the crossover, what you started noticing.
Well, if you see in the video, I've got a pretty solid nose here, so I probably have some anatomical advantages for nose breathing. But I saw these initial things about it, and I thought, and I've done a few workouts, 2-hour rides, inside, outside, just breathing through my nose. And my question was, and I even had a master's project where we tested this last year. The idea that nose breathing acts as a poor man's kind of
governor to make sure you're below your first lactate turn point. It turns out that's not true. It doesn't work that way. With training, people can get quite good at nose breathing, and they can achieve pretty darn high intensities just with, without opening their mouth. So that doesn't work. But there are other questions that are kind of interesting. There's been discussion about whether there are different neurological hormonal issues that emerge when you just breathe through your nose, and I don't know enough about that, but I do know that I find it interesting that on a good day, if my nasal passages are open and I just breathe through my nose for 2 hours, it's kind of calming. It's kind of it's kind of like it's almost meditative, and so I've done some nice, easy, steady state, like 200 watts for 2 hours and just breathing through my nose, and I kind of like it. It's got a certain, I don't know, there is a certain mindfulness aspect to it.
Once you get past the first few weeks, snot bombs that are just dripping out of your nose, like. Yeah. Well,
it's kind of, for me, it's like there are just days if I'll try and immediately my brain will just, no, I ain't doing it today. It doesn't work. I'm a bit tight in the nose. Whereas other days, okay, this is going to happen. So my body just gives me a feedback pretty quickly whether this is going to happen or not today. I've pushed myself pretty far up the scale, and I was able to get to almost like 300 watts, which for me is a pretty high intensity, just breathing through my nose.
What heart rate was that?
Well, if I stayed there, again, it depends on how long I stay there, right? Because that's like 300, 310 is what I can do maximally for 1 hour. And the first 5 minutes, my heart rate is 80% of max. The last 5 minutes at 100% of max, right? And this is an example. That's a great question because it's a good example. You can't say, well, what's your heart rate? Because then I have to ask you, how deep into the weeds am I? How long have I been going? And then I'll give you a decent answer. After 30 minutes, I'm at 90+% of heart rate, and it's starting to hurt, but at the first 5 minutes, I'm like, oh, I'm good. I got this. So this is such an important aspect to understand for people is that, you got to really attach duration onto these things, and workouts that start at threshold can end up at heart rate max. If you go hard, and if they're pretty tough to start, they can end up at maximum, intensity at the end. So there is no steady state, and that's very important.
Here's 2 examples that I want to just share. Like when I started out with nasal breathing for like an hour, after about 135 to 138, I kind of felt that crossover point of like, I need to start mouth breathing now. It starts to become a little bit uncomfortable. Fast forward like 6 or 7 weeks of training with that more and more, I started noticing it became 140s, 145, 150. And at the end, after 1 hour of like pushing it, I was able to run like a 608 minute mile at 165, 167 heart rate. And I was still nose breathing. And it was like so mind blowing to me to see how that crossover point was able to change that much in a relative short period of time as well. So that was
it's fascinating. And I don't know enough about it, what's going on, but my assumption is that the oxygen demand is fairly much the same, and so you might be a little bit more efficient on the breathing, but something's going on. Your brain, there's some adaptations that are happening pretty fast to allow you to get more air in. So because your body needs the air it needs the same amount of oxygen basically. Give or take a bit of efficiency on the ventilation aspect of it, So it's pretty interesting. The other thing with some sports, particularly running, rowing, you have something called entrainment, which means that the ventilation pattern links into the movement pattern. So if you're a runner, if you go out, next time you go out and run, you've probably done this where you count strides and you say, well, if I'm really easy jogging, it might be 4 strides in as I breathe in and 4 as I breathe out. That would be a really relaxed, slow rhythm. And then it might go to 3-3 as you pick up the pace just a little bit, but still quite comfortable. And then maybe once you get
pretty close to threshold, it might be more like 2-2 or 3-1, 3-2, or, so there's these step changes, literally of that, that are connected to the running frequency, the running cadence. So the running cadence and the breathing cadence link in some multiple of each other, right? And this is true in rowing. This is true in running. It has to do it. There's just certain situations where because of the running movement puts some demands on the diaphragm. You have to stabilize, and that, so it kind of locks you in to different patterns. And Jack Daniels, the famous running coach who had the book, Daniels Running Form, he talked about this decades ago.
Yeah.
But it hasn't really been, but we haven't really investigated it very much. But it might be a reasonable way to approximate your running intensity where you are. If you can just know, well, yeah, when I break through, when I go from 3-3 to 2-2, I've crossed the threshold. You with me?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Your inhalation exhalation pattern connected to your cadence. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking at, is whether we can detect this very clearly, and whether it links very clearly and individually these phase changes to intensity, to threshold, to anaerobic threshold, and so forth. Because if it does, then it gives you a kind of a poor man's tool in the field for saying, where am I?
Yeah, that's why I love athletes to run without listening to music too, so they can truly pay more attention to the signals from their body as well. So.
Yeah. There's a lot of technology going on. There's lots of other stuff going on. So don't misunderstand. But that's the one that I'm kind of zeroing in on to see if I can make a bit of a contribution and see, add something to the, because the way I look at it, the technology is only useful if it helps inform decisions, if it informs the training process, if it makes the athlete coach conversation better, if it adds to, I use the analogy of the heads up display. The fighter pilots, they need to keep their eyes on the prize. They need to keep their eyes looking forward, because they're moving so darn fast that if they take their if your head's down looking at all these instruments, you're going to get in trouble pretty quick and crash into a mountain. So you need to be able to keep your head up, but you need some information, and so then you have the famous heads up display where they are projecting certain data onto the screen of the athlete or their visor, so that they can see these numbers and see out on the horizon at the same time. Well, I think that's kind of what we want to have as athletes or coaches, that I want my athletes to be looking, focusing on the actual process of running or cycling or whatever, but there's certain numbers, certain quantitative pieces of information that can be useful to them. And we got to pick out the ones that are useful, because too many is overload. So is it 2 or 3 different things that might be useful, and that's that heads up display. And heart rate is probably part of that display, perceived exertion, maybe ventilation, maybe, so I'm just saying lactate for some, it's part of the heads up display occasionally. That's the idea, is find your little set of tools that give you feedback and help inform your daily adjustment process.
Love it. Maybe in the future there will be lactate numbers on the blood oxygen level. There might be glucose level. Yeah, it will be interesting to see where things are going to be going in the next years.
And just so we're clear, we know there's a lot of Olympic champions and world record holders that don't use any of that crap.
Yeah, that's the beauty, the simplicity of things sometimes.
I don't want people to walk away thinking, well, Steven thinks he can, technology is the key to success. No, I know that that's not true.
Yeah. Last 2 questions. Where can people find more about you? I know you're active on Twitter. What is your Twitter handle?
It's just Siren Seiler. It's just my, SPHSTEPHEN and then SEILER. So very straightforward. Yeah.
Any other platforms?
For the students, if you're a student, if you're connected to academia and things like that, then I am on what's called ResearchGate, which is, a repository or kind of social media for science geeks. but it is also a repository of a lot of the research publications. So it's a place where you can download articles and stuff that I've actually published, that, the substance behind the message here. So that's a channel. And then of course, like you mentioned, I dabble in making videos, low tech videos. I want to just a disclaimer there. I am not a director that's going to be getting any awards, but I just put out these videos occasionally about different topics related to training.
Low tech yet high value. And just to talk about like ResearchGate, 181 publications, more than 5,000 citations, and almost 500,000 reads over there. And I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. So
you're better. You're caught up better than I am. So so it's a resource. It's a tool, and I'm very happy that a lot of people do read that stuff. So that gives me joy. That's more important to me than scientific citations now, that it's actually finding a place in the practical world that it's helping people do a better job and train happier and keep a smile on their face more often, and still set personal bests in the marathon. I think both can happen. And I guess that's the end message for me, is that we can both have happiness and smile and enjoy training, and go dig deep and set new personal records and experience new breakthroughs. They're actually two sides of the same process.
Love it. Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate the time. I'll absolutely look forward to following the rest of your work development in the coming years. And especially in the area of sleep, that will be very fascinating to see as well. So thanks so much.
Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, not sleep. I actually meant to say the whole breathing pattern.
Yeah. Sleep's important too, but I'll let other people work on that. So anyway, but yeah, I've still got a few good years left in me, I think. So I hope I'll be able to do some decent research. So thanks for having me on the program.
And great. Thank you. Hello, Floris here with a few last closing comments. For this Extramilest episode number 50, we're giving away several different prizes. So you can win a $150 gift card to Path Projects, and you can win a lifetime access to my personal best running coaching program. And all you have to do is let me know in the YouTube comments what was your favorite lesson, quote, or takeaway from this episode. I know there were many different nuggets and everyone has different perception of that. Would love to hear from you. What was it that stood out to you over there? And I'm going to be picking one winner at random who comments over there. This actually becomes a really fun comment section. You're going to notice quite a few different comments from different perspectives, or people have their takeaways from this episode. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening. And in closing, I absolutely agree what both Dr. Siren Seiler and Eliud Kipchoge are saying, that it is so important to have joy in your workout. So have fun out there on your run. Bye now.